I'm someone who never really got The Sims. Like, I would be playing, like, quote-unquote violent games and hearing all this fuss in the papers about them. And I'd be coming into school and my friends would be talking about what they'd done to their Sims. Like, they'd be making Sims of the friendship group or like the class or something, like real people, and then drowning them or deleting all the toilets or deleting all the doors so they're trapped inside. And it's like, which of us is doing the more violent stuff here?
Yeah.
I'm just shooting guys.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Thoughts. I'm Katie, and in this episode I speak to Dr. Rebecca Davnall, a lecturer in philosophy and game design studies at the University of Liverpool and a member of the Olaf Stapledon's Institute for Speculative Studies. In this episode we speak about violence in video games, in particular whether a violent act in a game can be understood as morally wrong and how best to characterise the distinction between violence in games and other forms of media. Before we begin, I want to issue a quick content warning. Some of the examples discussed in this episode contain references to abuse which some listeners may find distressing. Thanks very much for listening. Here are some thoughts on violence in video games. Hi Rebecca.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Not bad, thank you. How are you?
Good, yeah, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about video game violence, and in particular your paper on the gamer's dilemma. But just to start off, quite a common question is obviously whether or not violence in video games actually incites violence in real life. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is probably like the obvious kind of starting point, right? It's been a moral panic over this for at least 35 years. And fortunately, some people have done some research, and we are starting to get to the point now where there is a kind of consensus emerging, I think. And the short answer is, do video games make our kids more violent? The short answer is maybe a little bit, but not very much. It does seem that there's a small effect where video games make you more aggressive, more likely to lash out, less likely to help others. But the effect sizes are comparable to other media. So it's very like film and TV and even violent music. But the idea that there's a horrendous wave of youth violence that is being caused by video games, there is no horrendous wave of youth violence at all. So it can't really be video games that are at fault for it.
Okay, so I'd like to move on to talking about the gamer's dilemma that you kind of set out in your paper. And that's kind of the springboard for all of it. So can you tell us just exactly what that is?
Okay, so the gamer's dilemma is this interesting problem of, over particularly the last 25 years, we've got more comfortable generally as a society with games where you shoot people, right? Military games, maybe Grand Theft Auto. There's less fuss about them than there used to be. And most people, if you ask them why they think it's okay to play these games, they'll say, well, it's not real, right? It's not real violence, it's just images on a screen. But if that argument works, then it works for all kinds of virtual violence. And usually most people, you can come up with an example of virtual violence that they'd be willing to say, no, that's not okay, even though it's not real. We're talking basically about games of abuse. Child abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, hate crimes. Very sad to say, all of these things exist. They're not hypotheticals. Usually you can pick an example from that, and the vast majority of people who are perfectly fine with Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty will say, no, this isn't okay. And so the gamer's dilemma is the problem of why that is. The term the gamer's dilemma comes from a paper by Morgan Luck, published in 2009, but the problem itself is at least a decade older than that. And it spawned this little body of literature around, okay, what's the difference between Call of Duty and an abuse game? Why is it that these two things provoke such different responses?
I think it's really interesting because my kind of gut reaction was to say both of them are okay. But it's just that the idea of one, it's so much more horrifying just in real life. Like if I just were to hear about sort of abuse in real life, I'd find that much more horrifying. And then also the sort of person that might want to play a game depicting abuse, it seems to me for some reason it just feels worse. But I couldn't think of a reason why it is at all.
Yeah. So yeah, you've picked up on two things there, which I think are quite important. One is that we regard some crimes as more shocking than others, or some kind of wrong actions as more shocking than others. And there is because this thing starts as a statistical claim, right? It starts as an observation about human behaviors and how human beings respond to these things. And to my knowledge, nobody's actually done the statistical research to show that, yes, this is a general pattern. In some sense, that falls in the realm of psychology, and there is a body of literature showing that our responses to ethical hypotheticals are powerfully affected by like our emotional state and our emotional responses. There's a great study, a neurological study on the trolley problem, for example, that shows that people will give completely different answers if you put them in different emotional states first. So there is this body of experimental kind of psychology and experimental philosophy literature showing that the shock factor makes a difference. And that's definitely active in these cases. The second thing you picked up on was the issue of the assumptions that we make about the player of these different games, right? We're kind of used to not making too many assumptions about the player of a violent game, what we typically regard as violent games, like Grand Theft Auto. Of course people play Grand Theft Auto. It's a massively popular game franchise, yada, yada. But if you start talking about a specific example, you get this situation where you assume that people go to it for whatever is specific about it. Now, there are massive specificities in Grand Theft Auto, right? Grand Theft Auto is not just a violent game. It's a game about playing a particular kind of American criminality. And there's some interesting stuff. I've done some work on what that means for how we interpret the violence in the game, like how race and class and so on play into it. But if we start talking about a game of child abuse, say, the immediate assumption is that anyone who plays that in some sense wants to do child abuse.
Yeah.
And if you wind the clock back, you can see that assumption about Grand Theft Auto. You can see the assumption that people playing Grand Theft Auto wanted to be violent criminals. And that assumption's just faded as we got more used to the game existing. So those are two issues that kind of make us more hostile to the abuse game than to the violent game, to use that kind of classification. But I'm not sure they really get at the heart of it, because I do think that there is a moral continuum here, and that there is a moral valence to what games we play and we endorse the playing of. And I think it has something to do with how real-world injustices are not just represented, but assumed in certain kinds of video game violence. Like an abuse game is based on the kind of power relationship that enables abuse. And those power relationships are prevalent in society, and they're powerful. And I think there's a mandate to treat them with a certain kind of respect, right? If you play around with things that are real harms in real life, in some sense that's disrespectful, and I take that to be disrespectful in quite a thick moral sense. It's a thing you shouldn't do to, disrespect victims of child abuse or disrespect victims of hate crimes. This is why we have triggering content warnings. And I've taught the Gamer's Dilemma in class, and I've had students be triggered by the examples that are used. So there are all these good reasons to think about how we use social issues in our media, and to think about how we do so respectfully and not. On the one hand, there's an assumption that all video games are disrespectful because they're just child's toys. And that's too extreme. It shows up, right? Some people have made that claim. But there are more and less respectful ways to engage with something, not just as a player of games, but as a developer of games, as a marketer of games, anywhere in the games industry. And so I think, yes, there's a difference in the shock response and the emotional response we have to these things, which explains a lot of the difference in our reactions. But I don't think that difference in shock levels is entirely misplaced. Right? There are reasons to be more shocked by some of these games than others. Just as some violent films are more shocking than others, right? Something I'm working on now is a comparison of the Gamer's Dilemma to a situation we might imagine facing an actor who's trying to decide what role to take or what role to play between taking a role in Macbeth, which is a very violent play, right? Macbeth does horrible things in that play. And we think, it's a great work of literature. It's a great honor for an actor to play Macbeth. But something like Birth of a Nation, the racist propaganda film from America, or the Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, we think you shouldn't participate in those. If somebody wants to remake one of those films, you shouldn't be a part of that, because in some sense there's a level of disrespect to marginalized groups going on there, which isn't present in Macbeth. And I don't think that's purely a shock issue, right? That's a moral issue.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is what lies at the basis of the gamer's dilemma. That's why there is a distinction between these things. It's got very little to do with the kind of virtual aspect of it.
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting because that doesn't seem to be at all exclusive to games. That seems to be something, there's conversations about that regarding all sorts of things that get depicted in films and books, and whether or not really we should be depicting such horrible things which have a sort of real world harm for entertainment purposes. And there sort of seems something a bit wrong about that, maybe.
Yeah. And the use of the phrase "for entertainment purposes" there is interesting, because that's the assumption, right? That it's for entertainment purposes. Lots of works of fiction depict these things for non-entertainment purposes, or like lots of survivors of abuse tell their stories with varying degrees of like abstraction into fiction, and those are really valuable texts very often. Allowing people to speak in their own voices is really important. But yes, it's really important to place this on a continuum of other media, and that's where the interactivity of games, or the differentness of games, becomes important, because there is this idea that somehow you're doing something different in games. I don't necessarily think that's true. Like the paper I've just published is an argument that we can understand the gamer as involved in existing things, particularly performance. So the reason I want to talk about actors is I think the gamer is a kind of actor. There's not always an audience, and some people have objected to this on the grounds that there's not always an audience for a gamer, but the gamer is part of their own audience. You're always, when you're playing a game, you're also kind of receiving the game being played for you. There's an audience relationship there. And the way in which the gamer chooses what to do is very like how an actor makes choices, or even like a stuntman, right? In a lot of games, the gamer's job is to make the things explode prettily, and the plot is handled by like the writer and the motion capture actors and the animators and stuff. And so the question of, are games different? Well, they're different from movies and books, but they're different in the way that some other existing art forms are different from movies and books, right? It's like acting or being a stuntman or something like that. And I think that gets to grips with, how do we talk about games as having this difference, having this felt experience difference that most of us who play games feel, without also saying they're completely different to all other media and nothing that applies to other media goes for games.
Yeah, I think because I sort of come back to this sort of idea of, because I suppose really what it's about is agency in games. And I think something that I really struggle with understanding is why, because there are some games in which it does seem that the plot isn't totally written out. Like there are ways that you can go. There's lots of sort of multiple endings.
Yeah.
Which then obviously implies that there is some element of choice. Like you can choose between, sometimes you can, but sometimes you can choose between killing somebody, you can choose between not. And it's not just about how you do it, it's about whether or not you do it.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of like how you kind of square that.
Well, I mean, so the technical term for this is these are multi-cursal narratives. Okay. Right? They are, it basically means maze-like narratives. And the thing is that's got a prehistory too. Maybe your older listeners will remember Choose Your Own Adventure books and Fighting Fantasy game books, which I had a few of when I was a kid, which are book forms of that. And there's a huge tradition of experimental and improvised theatre where all these things have been tried I'm not an expert on those traditions. It's something I'd love to read more about. Like, I'm not a theatre person, but that's the kind of theatre that interests me.
Mm-hmm.
And all sorts of artistic experiments around co-creation with an audience. So again, I don't think there's nothing to go to before video games to think about that. In some ways, the video games where there's, you play through the game and then half an hour before the end, you make a choice and that determines whether you get the good or the bad ending.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very limited form of this. I think something like The Sims is way more open-ended, right?
Yeah.
In The Sims, there's all sorts of ways your characters can end up and so on. And it's very open-ended, and it's a narrative, right? It's not a narrative that any of the game designers sat down and wrote. It's kind of spontaneously generated by the software and your interactions with it and various algorithmic factors and assumptions that are baked into it. And undeniably, you make choices playing The Sims that affect where you go.
Yeah.
I am not sure that the choice is the critical part of the difference there, at least in the sense of of treating it as analogous to, in real life, choosing whether to kill someone or spare them would be. It's much more like, maybe it's a bit like an author's choice writing a book. And again, if I'm writing a novel and I decide to have a character die, I haven't killed someone. And we don't talk of that as within a tradition of killing someone. We might say, oh, I fictively killed them. And readers of the book who like that character might be very angry at me, but they wouldn't necessarily think that I had done something morally wrong, right?
Yeah.
So altogether, yes, there are differences. I don't want to say that video games are completely pedestrian. They combine these things in new ways, and that's interesting. That's why I'm interested in playing them.
Yeah.
But it's not this complete transformative novelty that it's sometimes presented as, especially by video game marketing. Because the way to market products is to say, this is completely new and exciting and unprecedented, and video games do this all the time. I think we can find a midpoint between saying, well, everything that's here has been done before and this is completely unprecedented. And that's where the actual nuanced, interesting moral discussion is going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, so finally, I just want to ask you a bit. We have sort of touched on this, but just go into a wee bit more detail about representation video games. So things like in Grand Theft Auto, how it represents probably quite a stereotyped view of minorities and working class, and then the sort of ethics surrounding that.
Yeah, so this also is a bigger part of the issue. Grand Theft Auto is a great example because one of the biggest game franchises ever, fundamentally grounded in a very stereotypical image of how crime works. And that's an image of how crime works that's been used to justify policy. Continue, especially, like, this is really visible under Trump in America. He came to power talking about Mexican gangs, for example, importing masses of drugs to the US. And he had a very Grand Theft Auto image of these gangs and of what inner cities are like. And all of these things influence our assumptions about the world. It's not as simple as you play one military shooter set in the Middle East and now you hate all Muslims.
Yeah.
It's very good at reinforcing comfort in your own assumptions about these places, right? It entrenches these kind of racial hatreds fundamentally that underpin a lot of things. And then it makes you more accepting of the solutions that are proposed, such as more policing, such as more money for the military. And I think something similar goes for abuse games, right? They tend to portray abuse in particular ways, which maybe aren't the ways that victims would like to be portrayed.
It's interesting because it seems like the responsibility is sort of on the game's developers not to reinforce these stereotypes, but also on the player to be sort of active if they are going to play them and questioning them, or do you know what I mean? Sort of be in the right state while playing. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm quite happy with the idea that everybody's got a responsibility to this, right? The media, the media producers always have a massive responsibility because fundamentally they're the ones profiting, right? That comes with certain obligations. If you're going to profit off this stuff, you've got to be answerable to it in particular ways. But also, if you're engaging with a piece of media, tempting as it is to switch off and not think about it, it's really important that you have some sense of what it is you're getting into and what it might be doing to you. And that's difficult. It's tiring. Sometimes it takes the fun out. I actually find that sometimes I notice way more because I watch more attentively. And maybe we could all do with thinking a bit more about the stuff in the world around us.
Yeah. Right. I think that's probably all we have time for today. But thank you very, very much for coming on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. It's been really interesting. Do you have anything that you want to, I don't know, plug?
Well, the paper is freely available to read. You can have a look at it. Other than that, not really. You can follow me on Twitter at @Davnall. And sometime next year, I have a novel coming out, which I suppose that's exciting.
Yeah, brilliant. What's that?
It's a fantasy story about a ghost that falls in love with a living woman and decides he doesn't want to go towards the light, and various efforts that people go to get him to go towards the light. And yeah, that should be out sometime next year. I'm sort of finalising the contract with the publisher at the moment.
Brilliant.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. Right. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Thanks to everyone for listening. Remember, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at ThoughtsUFG and on Instagram at @thoughts_UFG. We hope you all enjoyed the episodes and we'll see you next time.